I think the significance is that the convoy probably never should have had to happen, but people are frustrated in this country and they have every reason to be.
And welcome back. This weekend marks the one-year anniversary of the so-called Freedom Convoy protests in Ottawa. In anticipation, Ottawa police say they will be implementing a zero-tolerance approach to noise, open-air fires, and more this weekend. So what is the legacy of the convoy protest? Did it leave a lasting impact on Canada and on Canadian politics? Let's take this to our panel of strategists. Greg McCachran from Proof Strategies leans liberal. Larissa Waller from GT and Company, she previously served as the head of communications for Ontario Premier Doug Ford. She leans conservative. And Anne McGrath is the NDP National Director. I'm not going to say where you lean, okay, not this time. Welcome to the three of you. Very nice to have you. Larissa, I'm going to start with you. 1 year after the convoy, we likely won't see the kind of event that it was a year ago, but the anger is still there. It is palpable and in a lot of ways probably justified. Has it, however, become a political tool for Mr. Poilievre?
I don't think it's a political tool necessarily for Mr. Poilievre. I think Mr. Poilievre is listening to people who feel that they have not been listened to by the government. And I think that the convoy itself escalated to the point it did because a lot of Canadians felt they weren't being listened to. I think this Prime Minister doesn't necessarily want to or know how to diffuse a situation. I think he probably had a lot of opportunities where he could have, but he doesn't, it didn't benefit him politically, or he dug in on principle. Sometimes it takes sort of a bigger man or bigger person to put principle aside and really focus on a practical solution, or how do we diffuse this? I think a lot of people are still very angry. They're not angry necessarily about COVID anymore. Now it's translated into other things: cost of living, crime, there's a grocery list of things, it's a grocery list of things to be mad about right now. And I think that anger has translated to other parts of our lives.
Greg, I want to ask you, let's look back at a year ago. Was this government unprepared for this? Did it come as a surprise?
Which government?
Because the Trudeau government.
Yeah, no, but the responsibility for that street is the city of Ottawa. It's two blocks to the north of us. And what's changed, and as you said in your opener, we have the police chief didn't last the occupation. We have a new police chief. We don't have a mayor, the same mayor anymore. He didn't run again, but his successor, his first two big appointments were senior appointments, worked for the former mayor. That's not gone over well in Ottawa. You talk about gatekeepers. There's gatekeepers on Wellington Street now. They're cement, and the street's been closed for a year. And the city right now is still wrestling what they're going to do with that, whether or not they're going to reopen to it. So I think the report will perhaps tell us, how much intelligence did the federal government have? We hashed a lot of this out last fall. Different agencies, had different, feelings on whether or not they should have seen it coming. I think that the danger is what Larissa just talked about, where they're not angry about this anymore because they can't do anything about that, so they're going to move their anger to something else. Anger is like fire, and if you play with it, you can lose control of it. And I think we have to be really careful about the way that extremism is allowed to come into the political rhetoric. Pierre Poilievre stood with these folks, brought them coffee. And I noticed when we hit the fall and we had the inquiry, Conservatives less and less were vocal about this.
That was the Emergencies
Act. The Emergencies Act inquiry.
Yeah.
Conservatives were not using anything from that. I think they're embarrassed. You talk to Conservative MPs from Ontario, they don't really want to be involved in this. Doug Ford didn't do anything about this. I think there's a big feeling from a lot of Conservatives that they just want this to go away.
Well, I mean, Doug Ford is not targeted by the anger. He's not going to say, hey, how about me, get angry with me.
Funny about that.
Well, look, that's a political survival. But I want to ask you, Anne, because, everybody talks about lessons learned. I don't know if any politician learned a lesson, but does this leave or change the way we're doing politics now? The tone has certainly changed. Justin Trudeau, some people actually there is hatred out there. I was at the cabinet retreat. I was covering it in Hamilton, and they followed him there, the protesters, and it's quite graphic what they tell him. Is Jagmeet Singh targeted by the same anger?
So the question of whether or not it's political, of course it's political, but and it remains to be seen what's going to happen this weekend. I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that a year ago, a relatively small group of protesters, in the grand scheme of things, who were highly resourced and very disorganized and who had incoherent demands, were able to hold this city hostage and able to do things at the Coutts border crossing, at Windsor, et cetera, because it was a failure at every single level of government. Greg talked about the police and the city and talk about Doug Ford and whether or not what his role was in all that. And we said, well, he wasn't there. He's the premier of the province, and he wasn't there. So it's like at every level there was this complete failure to grasp what was going on, and they were able to hold citizens across the country hostage in all of that. So I don't know if there have been any lessons learned at the level of the police. I've heard very encouraging things about, zero tolerance, and they're going to really make sure this doesn't happen again. But I heard that almost every single day during the 3 weeks that the blockade was on.
That was not zero tolerance at all.
It absolutely
was like 65
wasn't.
tolerance.
I mean, we were reassured every day that it was being dealt with, that it was going to stop, that they were going to do something about it, they were going to put more police down, all of those things, and nothing happened until the Emergencies Act was invoked. So, we'll see what happens with the inquiry into the Emergencies Act, but the truth is that it stopped when the Emergencies Act was invoked. So I don't know what's going to happen this weekend.
So, Larissa, they come this weekend. Should Conservative MPs or even Mr. Poilievre show his support as he did last year? Is this a thing of last year, and this year we will not see Mr. Poilievre with the protesters if they do indeed come to Ottawa?
No, I think that I would hope that the Ottawa police are ready. I hope that they're well resourced and well positioned. I think that when we look at the convoy and the lessons learned, we have to think about what propelled them to get there, and then what failures happened, as Anne said, at every level of government to allow them to stay, to allow them to position themselves where they were. I think if we only focus on the second part, the security of the people in Ottawa, and that is a massive thing to talk about and to protect ourselves from in the future, we cannot allow that to happen. But we also have to figure out how to talk about the anger that propelled them there. And I think that, Conservative MPs aren't going to forget that first part. And I think that the Prime Minister would be well positioned to think about, how do I talk to these people, listen to people who are really hurting, instead of mocking them or instead of digging his heels in.
The anger that propels them there is often pushed by misinformation and disinformation. And when you see Conservative MPs, you at the start of today's show, you pressed a Conservative MP a couple of times about whether or not the government sets the rate for the Bank of Canada.
Which it doesn't.
And yet they're repeating that. And again, that's, a bit, minor and off field of what we're talking about. But those people showed up here in Ottawa and they believed things that Justin Trudeau was responsible for that he didn't do. And when you see Conservative MPs and supporters and commenters and columnists, propelling those, that anger has a false base, but it's incredibly dangerous. Your right to protest and free speech should not impact the health and physical safety of people, whether it's here or in Coutts or wherever it was in Canada.
Is it controllable, and this anger? Is it something that politicians can do something about?
Well, I think if they want to, they can. I think that vaccines, for instance, were one of the issues that they were upset about. Vaccines, I believe, probably were used as a wedge during the election campaign. So, I think that if there is a will to actually do something about this, it is possible. Because, as I said, it is a minority. It's a fairly small group of people in many ways.
The protesters, yes, but the anger, I'm sure, is more than what the protesters are showing. the frustration anyway out
I
there.
totally agree with that. I think that there is a lot of anger out there, and I think it is around things like the cost of living. Groceries are big. I think housing is big. There's lots of concern about the kind of dilly-dallying and finger-pointing and jurisdictional games that are being played around the healthcare. While we watch the healthcare system disintegrate in many ways, there is anger, and the pandemic has changed a lot of things. We were very isolated during the pandemic. There's a lot of, social, and it exposed a lot of the really deep chasms of inequality in our country. So there's a lot to deal with for sure. But I believe that, we have to look at things that can bring us together. And I think that investments in healthcare, protecting our public healthcare system, I believe that dealing with the cost of living and the people that are most suffering right now, to try and find ways to alleviate that. I think there are things that can be done.
Well, that's a long list. The House comes back on Monday. I'm sure we'll be talking about this again. Greg McEachran, Larissa Waller, Anne McGrath, thank you.